Climate change is no longer a conversation just about the environment. As its impacts begin to change our landscapes and human behavior in mass migrations, competition for resources, and the like, it's now also a conversation about global security. So joining us now to explain, in Washington, D.C., Sherry Goodman, Senior Fellow, Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security. In our nation's capital, David Morley, President and CEO, UNICEF Canada. And here in our studio, Simon Dolby, Professor of Geography and Governance at Wilfrid Laurier University. Simon, I want to thank you for braving the 401, 2.5 hours to get to our studio tonight. You are a champ. And to Sherry and David, thanks for joining us in the American and Canadian capitals, respectively. We have assembled this group because Saturday night on TVO, we are going to present a documentary called Age of Consequences. And we want to take, just to start our conversation, let's take a look at a clip from that documentary, and then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, if you would.
Think about it from a military perspective. When I was leading paratroopers in Afghanistan, if 98, 99% of my intelligence told me that I was driving my platoon down a road and that 2 miles down that road, there's an ambush waiting for me, I don't get to say, yeah, but there's that 1% that says there's no ambush, so the hell with the other 99%, we're going to keep going down the road. I mean, that's negligence on an unfathomable scale. That's the debate we're having right now with regard to climate. The overwhelming consensus is we are facing a massive risk. Climate change is happening. We've got to decide whether they're going to act on it or not. And that choice has consequences.
The Age of Consequences, Saturday night on TVO. Sherry, I want to start with you because you are in this documentary, and I want you to give us a better sense about how you managed to get climate change on the U.S. military's radar screen. Help us with that.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. I served in the Defense Department in the 1990s when we were just becoming aware of the impact of climate change on military activities. And 10 years ago, I formed a group called the CNA Military Advisory Board, comprised of a dozen senior retired military leaders, where we undertook with the nation's leading climate scientists in both the United States and the UK at the time to really understand the science of climate change and its impact on military operations and military strategy. And we concluded from our year-long work that climate change is indeed a threat multiplier for instability in fragile regions of the world, and in fact is affecting us even in stable regions. We see it happening today. It's a real risk, and it's one that we need to include into our defense planning, our strategy, and all of our exercises and activities.
Okay, a bunch of follow-ups before we get the others involved here. First of all, you used that expression, threat multiplier. What does that mean?
Well, it means it takes any threat we have today. For example, take the conflict in Syria. Underlying that conflict is a long-term drought that exacerbated conditions in that region and made it more likely that populations would be at risk and that there would be conflict because there's inadequate food, water, and resources for the population. There is a direct correlation between that long-term drought and the rise of instability in the region. We see the same thing across the Arab Spring countries, where the Arab Spring uprisings in Egypt and Tunisia were preceded by drought across the wheat-producing countries of China and Russia and Ukraine. Russia, in fact, stopped the export of wheat just months before the Arab Spring uprisings. And that food shortage was a spark that lit the match that led to the Arab Spring uprisings. So we see now that climate change is affecting us across the Asia-Pacific region in Disaster Alley, where extreme weather events are occurring more intensely and more frequently, to sea level rise at military installations in the United States, to increased ocean temperatures, heat temperatures. And so we see this as a magnifying force for the instability that we face from other very real threats, such as terrorism and weapons of mass destruction.
Okay, and one more follow-up, Sherry, and that is, how open, as you tried to get the military to take this issue seriously, how open, in your view, was the military to doing just that?
Well, at first there was indeed some skepticism about, this is just an environmental issue. But in fact, the great thing about military leaders is that they're serious and they take risks and threats seriously. So any risk to their operation, whether it's a health threat, has to be accounted for. And so, you evaluate the level of that risk and the likelihood that it's going to affect your ability to conduct a military operation or carry out a military strategy. And so as we got into this, it became abundantly clear that those risks are rising. In the Cold War, we spent billions of dollars of U.S. GDP to deter what we perceived to be the major threat of that era, a bolt-out-of-the-blue nuclear attack by the Soviet Union. Fortunately, we were successful, and the Cold War ended. That was a high threat, but low probability risk. High consequence, low probability. With climate change, we arguably have a higher probability and equally high consequence threat that is approaching us right now. It's time for us to act.
Okay, David Morley, let me get you into the conversation now. I'd like you to help us understand about the disproportionate impact that climate change can have on some of the most vulnerable population in the world, and I'm talking, of course, about children. Fill us in on that, please.
Well, Steve, there's no question that climate change puts many children at risk. First of all, there's the numbers. There's more than 150 million children who are in drought-prone areas and 500 million children who are in areas that are prone to flooding. And both of those can have very serious consequences, because when there's a drought, when children don't get enough food, just as Sherry was saying, what food shortages mean for children can have a lifelong impact. If children don't get enough to eat, they become malnourished. If they're malnourished for a couple of years, that's going to have a lifelong impact. As adults, we could make it through that. But if you're a child and it's, say, between the ages of 4 and 6, you go without enough food, that's going to have a lifelong impact. And if you're living in a flood-prone area and floods come, that usually means waterborne diseases. And again, it's the poorest people, it's the most vulnerable people who are living in these places that are most likely to have floods, and many who don't have the capability to respond to droughts either. So that when droughts come, inflation comes in, food gets more expensive, and that means that there's less to eat as well for those children. So, we talk about, Sherry knows about the military side of it. For us at UNICEF, what we see is that children are at risk, and that puts families at risk, and that's a way of putting whole societies at risk.
In which case, give us some sense about how UNICEF Canada is responding to the threat that you just laid out.
Well, of course, we're doing emergency response when these kind of things happen. So in the famine that has just been declared in South Sudan, we're working to get food and medical care to them. In Somalia, we're working very hard with nutrition centers to try and help the children and families who've been affected. But one of the things that's so important is long-term community development, because you look at a country like Ethiopia, which is suffering the same weather conditions as Somalia, but for 20 years, UNICEF with the government of Ethiopia, a lot of help from the government of Canada too, we were able to set up a health and social network so that the poorest people weren't left behind. There are health posts, nutrition posts all around the country in areas which are drought prone. And so now, today, when there's terrible loss of life in Somalia, right across the border in Ethiopia, same conditions, but we're able to help communities have more resilience so that they can stand up to, they can stand when these kind of terrible conditions happen. We need to do this community development because it's a way to make communities stronger, families stronger, so that as the climate starts to change, as it starts to get more harsh, there we have in place the health system, the food distribution system, and the social security net that will mean that children don't suffer in the same way.
Very good. Simon, let me get you into the conversation now. Clearly the population understands what the environmental threat to climate change is. I want to know whether or not the link between climate change and national security, in your view, is widely understood as well.
It is in the United States to a much greater extent, I think, than in Canada. Mind you, as we speak, there are soldiers deployed in Montreal and elsewhere in Quebec in particular, doing emergency flood operations. Yep. This is not the first time troops have been deployed in this country to deal with this, and sadly, as climate change accelerates, more extreme weather is going to require them to be increasingly prepared to deal with these issues. We went through a decade of the Harper administration in this country where clearly climate and security just simply weren't connected up in the official thinking. And while I do talk to some folks in the Canadian military, clearly it hasn't been high on their agenda, with perhaps some exceptions wondering about what's going to happen in the Arctic in particular, because that may have fairly direct operational concerns. But the longer term thinking about what this means for Canada, for Canadian foreign policy, for defense policy, hasn't got the kind of attention that it has been getting for the last few years in the United States.
Well, since you mentioned the Arctic, follow up on that. What impact do you believe climate change is having on our ability to make the case for our sovereignty, or the status of our sovereignty up there?
Well, I think that the disappearing ice is getting everybody's attention. Have we got an effective Canadian presence in the Arctic? Has been a question that has been going for quite a while. We're talking about icebreakers on and off for as long as I've been a Canadian. We've been talking also about what to do in terms of a much more permanent Canadian presence in the Arctic. And of course, one of the real ironies of the question of climate change and increased access to the Arctic because of the decreasing ice on the oceans in summer at least, is that we're starting to think about oil exploration in that part of the world. And of course, this brings us to the real heart of the issue when it comes to climate change and security. Because clearly, if we are going to do exploration in the north, Russians, Norwegians, Danes, Americans, and a few others have got an interest in doing that. And yet, if we're really serious about climate change, we're not going to be serious about exploring for oil up there, because that stuff is going to have to stay in the ground if we're going to get serious about reducing our use of fossil fuels quickly. So we're faced with a really interesting connection here between what's being secured, what agencies are involved in doing the securing. Because clearly, if we're serious about climate change, we will need to cooperate as the Arctic changes. But if we're really serious about climate change, we won't need to be so worried about sovereignty insofar as it is linked up with who gets the exploration rights on this chunk of territory and this chunk of seabed. So we're facing a really interesting policy dilemma here. We don't have to worry so much about sovereignty if we get serious about climate change.
Sherry, can I have you follow up on the American angle as it relates in and around Alaska and how Americans might be viewing that?
Well, thank you, Steve. You know, this week is a big week for the Arctic. It's the week that the U.S. hands over chairmanship of the Arctic Council to Finland, and that event is occurring in Fairbanks, Alaska this week during a whole week of the Arctic, coordinated by the Woodrow Wilson International Center and the University of Alaska at Fairbanks. There are foreign ministers there from all the Arctic countries and many others as well. Secretary of State Tillerson and Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov will have an important meeting, and there'll be others as well. As was pointed out, the Arctic is changing faster than anywhere else on the planet because of climate change. It's warming, the permafrost is sinking, the long-term sea ice is melting at a rapid rate, and temperatures are warming. That is creating a whole new ocean in our lifetime. And now we talk about, America's fourth coast. For a long time in Washington, the Arctic was seen as Alaska. But it's really, the Arctic has a big impact globally. And in fact, what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. What the changes that are occurring across the Arctic have impacts across the globe and in the lower 48. And it affects farming and flooding and sea level rise. And at the same time, with more human activity, we're not yet prepared to operate in the Arctic in a way that will enable us to respond to the risks that could occur in the near future, the real risks of an accident from a fishing vessel, tourist vessel, other transportation that will likely occur with increasing rapidity in the Arctic, and also a potential oil spill. And so we need to be very mindful of the risks that are increasing, and we need to carefully balance those risks and think about also helping the people of the Arctic as their lives are changing. This in many ways is a harbinger of what's to come. We now see many remote villages in Alaska that will have to relocate because of either soil erosion, rising sea levels, permafrost sinking that are making their communities inhabitable. But that's happening not only in the Arctic, it's happening in Louisiana. And it's happening, of course, across the globe. So we need to be mindful of the impacts of climate change affecting the need for resilient communities and the need to reposition and think about how we carefully take care of these communities and then make ourselves more resilient, understand the impacts of changing energy use. For a long time, you know, Alaska was seen as a place where the economy has been dependent on oil and gas. And that's a very important conversation occurring in Alaska now, how to diversify that economy. You know, you see many remote Alaskan villages that for years had to be powered on diesel. Diesel is a dirty fuel that's exacerbating other sources of pollution in the region. But now we're beginning to be able to repower those villages with a combination of wind, occasionally solar, and smart grids. So the Arctic can also be a source of innovation. It certainly is in our Nordic countries, and I know Canada has begun to look at some of those same opportunities and issues. We do still need to be mindful of the fact that with more human activity in the Arctic, more opportunities for exploration and changing, particularly fish migration patterns, there's going to be more activity that we need to pay attention to that will affect the sovereignty and the rights of the countries operating there.
David, as you cast your glance around the world, what part of the world gives you the most concern as it relates to the issues we've been discussing tonight?
Well, certainly in the Sahel, that band south of the Sahara Desert is been a place where we've seen ongoing food shortages, and so that's a place we do also see that it's causing areas of unrest. Places like Mali, places like northeastern Nigeria, and around the Chad Lake Basin, there are places where children are suffering and where governments are unable to deal with what they see happening, so that we need to be working with them, as Sherry said, to help communities become more resilient. But we also have to look at our sources of energy, and we know that. And I saw a piece of good news just this week was in India, where India, you know, it's one of the largest users of coal and of traditional types of sources of energy, and a kilowatt hour cost of a solar panel dropped below that of traditional carbon producing energies. That's been the market at work in India, and now we're starting to see more small businesses, more homes who have a chance to electrify themselves through solar panels because it's becoming cheaper than traditional sources. So we have to look at both, right? It's how can the poorest families still get a chance to lift themselves up the economic ladder, but do it in a clean way? And this news from India this week is an important step in that, because what India does is also going to have a massive effect on all of the world in climate change.
Simon, I don't have to tell you, there are probably still, I don't know if it's some or many, so you tell me, people who are skeptical that this is in fact happening. They look at the Earth over the course of hundreds of millions of years, and they note that at times the planet has heated up, and then at times the planet has cooled down, and maybe that's all we're involved in right now. So let's go back to some of the examples we've talked about. A new sea, a new ocean up in the northern part of the globe. You talked about flooding in Montreal. We've heard David talk about famine-like conditions in countries all over Africa. Is there any question in your mind that all of those issues are related to climate change?
are all related to climate change. Quite dramatic changes in the Earth system are already afoot. So much so that my geological colleagues are actually talking about us living in a whole new geological epoch, because the sheer scale of what is afoot is what people have been struggling to grapple with. We are in very different times. The fact that the ice is disappearing from the Arctic much more rapidly than even a decade ago most of the projections suggested makes it quite clear that we are in new times. The connection with the floods in Montreal, increasingly we are seeing situations where, because the Arctic is heating rapidly, it's not the temperature difference between the extreme north and further south is one of the things that used to drive weather systems around, well, basically our latitude. And increasingly, because there's less of a temperature differential, there's less energy in that system. So in fact, what's happening is some of the weather systems are slowing down. And it's precisely the slowness of many of the big rain events to move through a particular area that's causing the intense flooding. This is what happened in Calgary a couple of years ago. It's what happened this week in our part of Canada. Quite clearly, there's a discernible connection between these factors. It also relates to how weather patterns are shifting further south. And David was talking about India. One of the things that's very worrisome is what may happen to the monsoon season, because it's becoming less predictable. We're getting more frequent El Niños, and the climate modelers are burning up a whole lot of computer time trying to figure out how this is going to play out, because it matters greatly if you're a young child in Ethiopia or Somalia. All of these things are all coming at the same time. Sherry mentioned earlier the crucial issue back before the Arab Spring about the global wheat markets. When the Russians panicked, and they had a terrible, hot, dry summer in 2010, they panicked and said, well, we can't risk exporting food because, well, we're going to run short. That caused a spike in the international price. And of course, markets do what markets do, which is fluctuate in moments of perceived scarcity. And that was part of what caused the knock-on effects both in Syria and in Egypt. So what we need to think about, both at the small scale in terms of what David is talking about with children in Africa, and at the much bigger scale in terms of how we handle these perturbations to our economic system. Good global governance can make a big difference in terms of anticipating the things like the drought-led distress in Somalia and Ethiopia. But we do need global governance, and we need people to understand that all of these things fit together so that we can actually get food to the people that need it when the warnings come through.
Let me follow up on that global governance angle. Sherry, go back to you with just a few minutes left here. Let's see if I can get a couple more items on the table here. You know, the United States government has just massive resources, never mind the military, but also, for example, Health and Human Services, the Environmental Protection Agency. I mean, there are numerous departments, Homeland Security, numerous departments that are comprised within the American government that presumably could be brought to bear to deal with this issue. I guess my question for you is, how coordinated are the efforts among all these different departments to keep their eyes on the prize here?
Well, they were becoming much more coordinated, I would say, over the last 8 years. In recent times, there has been a dedicated whole of government effort to address climate change, its impacts, the need to innovate and become more resilient as a society, and also harness all the human energy that's available both within the federal agencies you mentioned and many more, and across our communities in the United States at all levels of government. And to integrate, very important, as was alluded to here earlier, the efforts that are occurring in defense, development, the long-term need for more sustainable, resilient communities, and diplomacy. That's very much at the forefront. You'll see that play out, I think, in the Arctic Council meetings this week. The Arctic Council is a body that is about governance of the Arctic, does not include security, but does include many very important items in the Arctic, among the Arctic 8, and now many, many more observers from countries like China and Singapore that see opportunities in the Arctic. They're looking as well at how do we do search and rescue? How do we better understand environmental needs? How do we reduce black carbon? How do we wire the Arctic so there's better communications? So all of those needs take both the operation of governments at various levels across various agencies, both in the U.S. and elsewhere, and they also take the private sector. You know, let's be clear, a lot of this innovation, a lot of the resilience we need, from the smallest village in India or Africa up to making our large cities like New York and New Orleans more resilient for the next storm, are going to take public-private partnerships and harnessing resources across all levels of governance.
Okay,
and
let me
so
jump in here if I
very
can,
much
Sherry.
We can continue.
Thanks. Let me just jump in because we've got less than a minute to go here. Simon, I want to give it to you. We've got the documentary airing on TVO Saturday night. We've had this conversation here. One hopes an increasing awareness of the global security issues, not just the environmental issues. What impact do you want to have this conversation, that documentary? What impact do you want it to have?
What we really need to do is think about what we do after fossil fuels. What we have to think about is the next economy. We've got very wealthy, relatively speaking, by burning a lot of stuff over the last century and a bit. What we have got to do now is reinvest the proceeds from that huge economy into the things like solar panels, microgrids, into making people in Somalia and Ethiopia more resilient, as Sherry says, but also we've got to think long and hard about how we get ourselves in North America off fossil fuels, because relatively speaking, we are burning an awful lot of stuff. And that's the key crux of this issue. It's about what we build for the future. Security is about shaping the future, as the American military likes to say. What we need to do is shape the future in a way that builds an economy that does not rely on burning things to live well.
Let me thank our guest tonight, Sherry Goodman in Washington, D.C., David Morley, UNICEF Canada in our nation's capital, Simon Dalby from Wilfrid Laurier University here in our studio. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.